Right. So yeah. So it's just I mentioned this already, but in some cases, Baxter and Cigar have reason to suspect there's a pre-initial, but they can't tell what its place of articulation is, so they write it with a capital C. Okay. So we start with pre-initial S. Basically, all researchers who think there are consonant clusters at all think there is a pre-initial S, but there is kind of quite, I mean, I would even say vicious disagreement about in which circumstances you should reconstruct this type pre-initial S. And Zev Handel has a nice article that kind of, where he's trying to kind of make the camps kiss and make up. So I think that's a good place to go for that. But I'm going to stick with Baxter and Cigar's presentation. So type pre-initial as one of the origins of Middle Chinese, type pre-initial S as one of the origins of Middle Chinese S. So here's a Shesheng series where you see contact between M initial words and an S initial word. Yeah. So here and in other places, you will see that I give a pre-chin form of the script, and I'm not doing that in any kind of rigorously paleographic way. It's just to help you see that the analysis of these characters as belonging to the same Shesheng series is plausible. So if you look at the fourth character on the slide, it's not really obvious that it belongs in this Shesheng series. But if you look at its pre-chin form, it seems pretty plausible, right? So in this series, we have, let's say two words that start with M, one that starts with a with an X, which actually it's probably some kind of font problem in my presentation. There should be a little circle under that M, because as we saw yesterday, one of the sources of velar fricatives is voiceless labial resonance. So, if you look at those first three, you're like, oh, okay, we did that yesterday. But now today we add in, look, what is an S initial word doing in this series? Well, Baxter and Cigar say, actually, it also was an M initial, but it had an S pre-initial. So that's their solution to that. And then I just am trying to go through kind of systematically in type A syllables. So here we have SM reconstructed in a type A syllable, and here we have SM reconstructed in a type B syllable. Okay, so now, I don't want to go through this too fast, but it's kind of much of a muchness is what they would say here in the UK. So SN develops into S in type A syllables. And here's the evidence. We have a Shesheng series that's mostly N initial, but it has an S initial word in it. And in type B syllables. So again, mostly N initial, but one S initial word. And now with ng, so we have in type A here a mostly ng initial series, but with some words that start with S. And in type B, again, a mostly ng initial series, but with one word that begins with S in Middle Chinese. Okay, now with the lateral, so I mean, and this is actually a nice series in terms of showing you just how messy a Middle Chinese, in Middle Chinese garb, a Shesheng series can look. But we have this contact between ya and da and ta. So we saw yesterday, we reconstruct that as a lateral series. Then we have some S initial words, one type A, one type B, which is convenient because then we can just use the one series to prove both sound changes. So we reconstruct SL as one of the sources of S. And, same style of argument. Here we have a uvular series that suddenly has it's actually a labio-uvular series where we have a character with an S initial. So, why not reconstruct a type pre-initial S? I will state it slightly differently, which is when a person has a syllable-based orthography and they want to write a word that they don't know how to write, they turn to a similarly pronounced word and then press it into service, right? So I'm actually, I haven't written it yet, but this is what I'm planning to talk about in my evening lecture next week. So a very simple, example. Let's say we speak modern English, and we've just invented writing. So we draw a picture of a deer to mean the animal deer. And then we find ourselves wanting to write a letter back home to our mother, and we want to start it with "Dear Mother," but we have no writing system, so we don't know how to write the word deer. So we draw a picture of the word deer. And now that works well because deer and deer have segmentally identical pronunciations, at least in my dialect. Yeah, okay. And then later, in the letter, I find myself wanting to say I bought a new steering wheel for my car, and I think, gosh, how am I going to write the word steer? And then I think, well, it's awfully similar to deer, but it's not the same. So maybe I'll write a picture of a deer with a little car next to it, and then my mom will be able to say to herself, okay, what word sounds like deer but has to do with cars? And then she'll say, oh, he probably means steer here. Yeah. So that is called the Rebus Principle, which is basically, I don't know, let's stick with bolts here. He thinks basically whenever you invent a script, ex nihilo, you start with very iconic, things, and then you move to more abstract things through pronunciation using the Rebus Principle. So we imagine that's what we're looking at when we see a Sheshang series, is like, this is a series of morphemes that could be related to each other via the Rebus Principle, which means that their pronunciation has to have been pretty similar. Yeah. And then the question is, which is partly how can I say, a question of your a priori assumptions, is how similar can something, does something have to be permissible to use this Rebus Principle? Let's say in Li Fengkui's version of the Sheshang hypothesis, you say syllables must rhyme and have homoorganic initials in order to qualify for this kind of Rebus relationship. And then I would say that you can really set up different Chinese historical phonologists on some kind of spectrum in terms of how doctrinaire they are about this principle, where Baxter and Cigar are very doctrinaire. Like, they really think, you cannot leave that S alone. You cannot say that, people were like, oh yeah, gun, sun, whatever. Yeah. Whereas other schools feel like, come on, like each act of inventing a new character happened in a specific time and place by a specific person, and there's no way we can get in their heads and know exactly what they were thinking. And similarly, we can be pretty sure that they didn't hold some giant committee meeting where they all agreed, like, we will only invent new characters that have homoorganic initials and rhyme. Yeah. So those people feel like you shouldn't push the Sheshang hypothesis too strongly. And this is, kind of, maybe you'll get used to this, but I feel like, the truth doesn't matter. What matters is what's good methodology. And clearly good methodology is to be as doctrinaire as possible, right? And then let yourself propose ridiculous things for ideological reasons. And that is how you will discover why they are ridiculous. Yeah. So that's, my feeling on this. And I think that actually in the preface to his dictionary, Schussler does this. Schussler thinks Baxter and Cigar go way, way too far. And so he tries to tell little stories about like why in this and this situation there was a counter prevailing consideration where basically, someone found himself in a tricky situation. And so he found a pragmatic solution in terms of how to write something that overrid the Shesheng hypothesis. And I think that's that's right. Which is to say, that's exactly the conversation we need.
It's valid. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, we need a conversation between the ultra ideological Shesheng adherents and their critics who can come up with very good stories about why being so ideological doesn't work in particular cases. Another labia uvular, now in type B, a series that has an S initial, so let's reconstruct another S cluster. But in this case, I'll just say it's not clear to me how Baxter and Cigar decide whether or not this particular word is aspirated. And I will also point out that there are no type B syllables that Baxter and Cigar reconstruct with an S prefix to uvulars, but without labialization. So we don't get any, as far as I can tell, in the 2014 book, we don't get any SQs without a W or a medial R. And I just think that's it's a pattern I noticed. Maybe it's totally meaningless, but I think that's the sort of, we need to be on our toes for these sort of phonotactic holes and wonder whether maybe that they point to, maybe problems in their analysis. Okay, so now here's a series where we actually have an S connected to a velar, and actually this is one where morphological speculation comes in. They think script notches and wedge are etymologically related, and I think that's actually how they present it in their book. But I just sort of point out to you that this is also a Shesheng relationship. So you can posit at least some kind of S cluster in the word wedge purely based on the Shesheng relationship. But the mismatch of the uvular with the velar is a problem. And you could, of course, reconstruct the velar as a uvular, but the series overall does not have any other words that are incompatible with a velar initial reconstruction. Okay, so now, I'm moving on again, another example where we have a uvular series, but with an S word in it. And in this case, I would say it's not clear to me why they choose aspiration rather than without aspiration, or why they don't reconstruct this series with velar nasals, because you can have a velar nasal origin of both the velar fricative and of course the velar nasal, right? So and maybe this is just a case of showing you that there's a lot of flexibility in their system, right? If you just look at these three examples, you could reconstruct it as they have, SQH, MQH, and QH, or you could reconstruct it SNG, NG, and NG, sort of voiceless NG. And I think somehow that's just, I don't know, this is kind of maybe just a question of taste. I think that would have been a slightly simpler analysis because it would have left the second character, the velar nasal, it would have just left it alone. Yeah. Okay. But in case they do what they do. And just to point out that they think there's actually a dialect split where SQH develops into ts in a different dialect. And actually, I think one of the most interesting and kind of productive areas of their book is pointing to hypotheses of dialect variation that can then be more systematically explored. Okay, so now, STS cluster. Well, here's, this one's a little, well, yeah, this one's a little, oh, yeah, okay. So you have a TS in the first one, and you have an S in the second one. So they say, well, maybe the S comes from an STS. Yeah. And here's the same in type B syllables. So you have a TSH and an S. So you think, maybe it's a STS. Okay, and now those were all examples of S clusters that became S in Middle Chinese. So now we will look at S clusters that become SR in Middle Chinese. And, it's basically not going to shock you that they're the same kinds of situations where there's a medial R. So in the most simple case, they think SR becomes SR. Yeah. And here's the evidence for it. We have a kind of R series, and there's an S in it, so or there's an SR in it. So maybe take it back to SR. And I will just point out that they appear not to reconstruct any words with type A SR, although they do reconstruct S voiceless R in type A. So that's just, I don't know, I just feel it may seem kind of random for me to say, oh, look, here's a hole, but I think it's good to draw attention to these things. Okay, so then we also have SNRA becomes SRA. Like in this case where, you have, I don't know, it's pretty clear, right? You have velar nasal series, and then you have an SR in it, so you take it back to S velar nasal R. They appear not to reconstruct any words in type A with this cluster. Okay. Now, that was it for SR. Now we move on to SY in Middle Chinese. So they propose these changes in type A syllables. So st, sk, sk, they all become sh. But the SK to sh change only occurred before front vowels. And this is part of the so-called first palatalization, which I hit on a little bit in the presentation about the six vowel theory, which is that you got palatalization of velars before front vowels as one moment of palatalization before you get the overall palatalization of type B initials. Yeah. Okay, yeah, that's what I just explained. So the restriction is a result of the first palatalization of Old Chinese. Yeah, so and this is basically how you get the relative chronology right. Yeah, so we imagine that you had something like ski. So let's say ki changes to chi. Well, so then you think ski probably changes to ski, and then ski changes to she as an exact parallel of the change that we also saw of sti changing to s. Yeah. And I'll just actually, I don't know, I feel obliged to say, because I'm a typologist, these sound changes of sh to sh and sta to or s to s happened in Old Tibetan, like are like philologically attested to have happened in early Old Tibetan. So they're sound changes that feel very dear to my heart. Let's put it that way. Okay. Now aspiration after initial S, Shesheng series mix homoorganic initials of different manner types. So it is not possible to distinguish aspirates on the basis, after like it's, let's put it this way. SP and SPH, are neutralized in Middle Chinese because both of them turn into S, yeah, if you like, yeah. So Baxter and Cigar do reconstruct these differences, but on the basis of aspiration in Min or other dialects. So that's just basically an answer to if you were wondering to yourself, how can you know whether these things were aspirated or not? Because it's neutralized in Middle Chinese after a pre-initial S. That's the answer. Is you look at things other than Shesheng series. So here we have ST goes to sh. So you see, a nice dental, dentals and palatals. Actually, this answers. This is an example. It came up very end of yesterday. Are there Shesheng series that mix palatals and dentals that argue for the sound change of dentals to palatals in type B? Well, here's an example. But it's also an example of sh initial words intruding into a dental Shesheng series. So is evidence for st goes to sh change. And here's I presented these changes already. Now I'm giving you the evidence, right? That's what's happening here. So here's a velar series, and you notice one with high front vowel and evidence for ska because there's a sh that is intruding into it. Yeah, and then I will just mention that Baxter and Cigar think that in type A syllables, ska changes to ka rather than to sh, but they don't use Shesheng evidence for that, so I'm not going to mention it now. And by implication, they would say that ska develops into ka also in type B syllables, when not in front of high front vowels, but they don't explicitly say that, as far as I can tell. Okay, so now with aspirated K, and they propose the aspiration because of aspirate pronunciations, such as actually including in Mandarin, in Guangzhou, which point to a Middle Chinese reading with an aspirate palatal. But the actual Middle Chinese reading is with an S, right? Yeah. Okay. Now, tight pre-initials as an origin of Middle Chinese Z. And you'll remember yesterday when I presented the simplex initials, I said we can get rid of the Z because it has so many origins. Well, now is where we're going to see those origins of Z. They all involve pre-initial S. Okay, so here we go. Before voiced uvular. So this is a uvular series. Why is it a uvular series? Just to kind of, repeat things so you get used to them. Well, because you see contact between ya initial and a velar. So it has to be a uvular series, and we reconstruct the ya to a voiced uvular. And then we have a Z that, that intrudes in this series that we think is a uvular. So why not reconstruct it as an S before a voiced uvular? And then you can understand the voicing assimilation as the reason that it changes into a Z. Baxter and Cigar also reconstruct SD and SMT as sources of Z, but not on the basis of Shesheng evidence. Okay, and then we also have, S little gr changes to ZR in this series. And now, we go from origins of Z to origins of zha. And they're very parallel to the origins of sh that we saw. So here is a series that is clearly velar because it mixes j in type B and g in type A, and then it has a zh initial. So let's propose that it comes from SG. And in general, they believe that SG developed into G, but their evidence for this does not come from Sheshong series. So again, very parallel to the SK situation, which is that this SG goes to J would only have happened before high front vowels because of the first palatalization. Okay, and now tight pre-initial S as one of the origins of tsara. So Baxter and Cigar maintained that a tight pre-initial S before QR gave rise to tsara. And here's evidence for that. So we have a glottal initial, which might come from a uvula, and we have contact with a tsara. So they let's say this is the kind of problem that motivates them reconstructing this sound change. And actually, maybe this is a good one in terms of, Schussler. I mean, I don't know about what Schussler would say about this particular case, but he would look at something like this and say, like really, it maybe, I don't know, maybe these aren't a Sheshong series, or maybe there's, this is the kind of place where I think he would be a little bit suspicious in terms of, well, it's not prima facie totally obvious that a tsara would come from a skara. But if you want to make the Sheshong hypothesis work on this Sheshong series, well, Baxter and Cigar have managed to do that. Okay. And then a similar one from type B. So you have tsara connected to a glottal. So, there you go. And now the aspirate equivalent. So this is pre-initial S as one of the origins of tsa. So Baxter and Cigar take tsa as a reflex of a voiceless resonant prefixed with S if there is any evidence of connections to words that are otherwise known to have resonant initials, whether voiced or voiceless. So here's an example. S before voiceless N in type A syllables, they think changes into tsa. And here's the reason why. It's because of these two words. And you see why I've given the pre-chin orthographic forms, because the modern forms of the characters doesn't make it obvious that these are related. So the second one means person, and the first one means 1,000. I think if I'm wrong about that, someone tell me. So they were written very, very similar in right back to Oracle bone inscriptions. So they think, well, they must have been similar then, right? And they don't cite Sheshong evidence for the same change in type B syllables, but they do reconstruct the change in some words. So in particular, this word twice, and they don't quite spell it out, but I think it's pretty clear that what they're thinking is that the word twice is related to the word two. Yeah, so it's a etymological speculation, and that this sound change would give you the machinery to link those two words. Yeah, okay. So now before a voiceless resonant, voiceless lateral. So we have a nice lateral series, connection between a da and a ya. And then there's a tsa initial that intrudes. So why not use the machinery we've already developed to solve that problem? They appear not to reconstruct any words in type A with this cluster. Now the aspirate equivalent. So here we have a connection between a tsa initial and a ta initial. With the cha, is the usual dentals palatalizing in type B. So they say, okay, maybe we've already seen this kind of argument before. Yeah, so that's another sound change, and then onto this one, which I think I've mentioned already, that SQH changes to sa or tsa depending on dialect. I include this here. It's not exactly Sheshang evidence, but it's pretty similar because it's two readings of the same character, right? So this character means slipper or shoe, and it has two readings, one with a sa initial and one with a tsa initial. So I would say, generally speaking, I don't think they articulate it as a principle, but it makes sense. When there are two readings of the same character in the same meaning, that's kind of pretty good indication of let's say, a dialect split and then borrowing into the same, let's say, standard that gets represented in the Guanyin. Okay. So it's not clear to me on what grounds they reconstruct a uvular in this word, kind of per se. So it appears to be because because of this loan into probe mien, which has a velar fricative initial. Yeah. So so I think the presumption is that this word shares the same root. Yeah, I don't want to get sort of drawn into these details, but they're in the presentation if you want to look at them later. But they do show kind of that the level of sophistication, I think, and I mean that in a good way, in the 2014 book, which is, you look at this intricate interrelationship between borrowings into unrelated languages and Sheshang series and etymological speculation. Okay, so now just sticking with, well, yeah, let's try to get through the S initials. So they propose both sra and thra as two sources of thra in Middle Chinese. Here's some Sheshang evidence. A character that starts with thra having contact with a character that starts with thra. In type A syllables, instead, as we saw earlier, they have thra develop into tsa. And then here's the other source of tsa, which you get from this case of a character with two different readings. But I would say that I'm a little skeptical here, because if the S prefix, which you see in the first of the two readings in their system, is a morphological aspect, one would expect it to somehow contribute to the meaning. And it doesn't. The two readings, refer to the same meaning. Okay. Oh yes, so we're almost done with the S's. So we get S as a source of the. So in the first of these bullet points, you see Sheshang evidence. So you see a contact between Piang and Zhang. So they think, well, the second character must somehow have a labial in it, because otherwise they wouldn't be in the same Sheshang series. So they reconstruct that back to SB. And then this is, kind of not technically a Sheshang series, but exactly that sort of Rebus principle I was talking about, which is this one character in early sources splits into two characters to distinguish two different meanings. It meant nose and self. So the reading meaning nose is with a B initial, and the reading meaning self is with a Z initial. So it's very similar, and they take it back to an SB cluster. So now that's basically it for pre-initial S's based on mostly Sheshang evidence, and I'll just sort of wrap up that section. And I have a concern because I don't see much sort of elegance in this in these proposals. Yeah, so tsa tsa za, you might expect them to have similar sources in pre-initial S, but they don't. And I mean, maybe this isn't a big consideration, but I think it points to the fact that what's missing from the 2014 book, which was in the 1992 book, is really ordered sound changes. Like let's move away. This is sort of, I don't know, a proposal, if you like, as a discipline. We should move away from this sort of ad hoc proposing sound changes to fix particular Shesheng series and say, no, we need to come up with a coherent story of how did the one language develop into the other one through ordered sound changes. And I don't see that is very easy. And actually, at one point, I sort of intended to do that in my book, and it turned out to be, it would have delayed the book by a few more years, so I decided not to. Anyhow, so that's one sort of reservation. And then also, I've been pointing out gaps. So let's look at the distribution of pre-initial S. Well, we don't have, spa, ska, zka, but we do have zba and ska in type B syllables. So it just seems very like, weird distribution. Now, I think what Baxter and Cigar would say is, well, these clusters probably existed and we just haven't figured out what evidence to look for to reconstruct them, or they were lost without a trace. Things can be lost without a trace. But I think both of those stories of were they lost without a trace or what evidence should we be looking for to reconstruct them would sort of be natural consequences of an ordered list of sound changes as part of our theory of Old Chinese reconstruction. Okay. And then as mentioned, this is just more kind of objections I have to the distribution of the S. So it's clear that much more work remains to be done on Old Chinese phonotactics. I think that there are these things like also, having a first person pronoun that starts with a velar nasal happens in Sino-Tibetan and in what language family is Kasi in Austro-Asiatic and I don't know. My inclination is to say these are sort of that there are materialist explanations for these things somehow in terms of like I don't know in human biology and communication needs. That are also things like actually one that I've been thinking a lot about recently is it a coincidence or is it a borrowing that Indo-European has a word something like quen for dog, and that Old Chinese has a word something like quen for dog, but actually Baxter and Cigar reconstruct that not with an N but with an R, so that you get something like quar as dog, and then I sort of think, well, it could be a coincidence because having a word for dog like curl or grr is not so surprising. I wouldn't go that far because the use of a second character to represent loose pre-initials is not at all systematic in old Chinese. And I would again sort of compare to Sumerian, where Sumerian had like actually it's a very interesting thing, which I think is a very good comparison. Maybe some of you know more about Sumerian than I do, but the earliest stages of Sumerian have the worst evidence for prefixes. And then as the prefixes actually became unproductive, or as no one knew Sumerian and had to learn it as a second language, the writing of the prefixes becomes more systematic. And I think that has a natural explanation, which is actually that when the prefixes were totally productive, you didn't have to write them. You could just say the kind of overall syllables, and people would know the necessary grammatical interpretation and apply the necessary prefixes for that grammatical interpretation. But the less you could rely on people to actually productively use this morphology or to have command of it, the more you had to write it explicitly. And I think actually, in a sense, the problem for Old Chinese is that we have no Akkadian. There was never a moment where a huge body of foreign speakers needed to learn Old Chinese when it still had pre-initials. And if that had been the case, I think we would have much stronger evidence. But I think kind of, I mean, you can almost think like as a thought experiment, what would have happened if the Sumerians lived until today? Well, they might well have ended up with a kind of highly analytic, tonal language, and the philological evidence for those prefixes would be extremely scant because the occasion never would have arisen naturally to write them down. They just, yeah. Anyhow, that's my sense, which is to say the preservation of those two character writings is really specific to the Shujie for the reasons that I said. We will get to, is there Shesheng evidence for loose pre-initials? I think so, but it's later in this presentation. This really doesn't bother me. I mean, maybe it's because I'm a Tibetologist, but I think that having, SP, like I don't know, SMTR, like having loads of initial clusters, but only one glide, it doesn't bother me. I mean, maybe it should. Oh yeah, so I have self-consciously not said anything about morphological structure, because I think Shesheng series as evidence don't point to that. So I think that yeah, you can understand that actually all pre-initials. That's what that's what Sagar's 1999 theory was, that all pre-initials are morphological affixes. All roots have a kind of C optional R vowel C, but it's clear that in certain cases, actually I would point to elbow as an example, which is now they reconstruct elbow as something like tukru, and I think there's very good reasons for reconstructing elbow that way, but they don't have any theory about the morphological function of the tu. Yeah, so I think that yeah, this is exactly the sort of thing I was explaining, which is that like the current version of the pre-initial theory passed through a phase where morphological structure of the root was the primary consideration, and I think that was very helpful for them, but it's not clear how much they're sticking to that as an idea at the moment. Let's say this is actually gets to the controversy about the pre-initial S that I referred to sort of at the beginning, where Meitsulin in particular reconstructs an S where Baxter and Sagar reconstruct voiceless resonance. So Baxter and Sagar sort of, well, it's not worth rehearsing that whole discussion, but I would say the problem that Meitsulin has is explaining the evidence that they explain with pre-initial S. I don't remember whether he has an alternative theory for that. But what your point is that like, there clearly are cases, and we saw some with like person and thousand, where there's variation in a Shesheng series or in a word family, so-called, between voiced resonance and voiceless resonance. So Baxter and Sagar recognize that problem and say, someone else can deal with that later. Maybe, probably, these voiceless resonance did start as some sort of constant cluster, but they think at the level of at the synchronic level, they're interested in reconstructing. Old Chinese had, let's say N voiceless N, SN, and S voiceless N. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, if you like, at whatever moment Old Chinese was, yeah, which is, let's say, in their approach, as early as possible, based on entirely Chinese data, and I think they're very good about that. Much more so, I think, kind of they go a little too far. Much more so than, let's say, Pang Wuyun or Zhang Zhen Shangfan. Baxter and Sagar really feel like you cannot use comparative data when you're working out Old Chinese. Comparative data to, say, Tibetan and Burmese.